The chainsaw was still running when I stepped into the fog, chewing through the last tree like it had permission. Fresh sap burned my nose. The ground was wet under my boots, soft where roots had been ripped out. 37 cottonwoods lined this ridge yesterday. Now half of them were gone, laid out in clean, deliberate rows like someone planned it. I didn't hear any warning. No notice. No call. Just engines at 6 a.m. and wood hitting dirt. Something felt off before I even saw the boundary stakes. They were new. Bright orange. Not mine. I walked closer, slow, counting stumps. Each one cut low and clean, right past the property line marker I installed myself 5 years ago. That's when I saw the crew lead glance at me, then look away like he wasn't supposed to make eye contact. I asked who authorized this. He pointed behind me without answering. I turned and saw her. Meredith Caldwell stood on the slope in white tennis gear, sunglasses on, holding a clipboard like she was inspecting a job she owned. Her SUV idled behind her, door open, music playing soft like this was just another morning. She smiled when I looked at her. Not surprised. Not confused. Like she'd been waiting for me to show up. "We're improving the view," she said, calm, like she was explaining the weather. The lake sat behind me, still hidden by the few trees they hadn't reached yet. Or maybe the ones they chose not to. That part didn't sit right. I asked her what gave her the right to cut anything on my land. She tapped the clipboard and said something about a view corridor easement. The words sounded rehearsed. Too smooth. I stepped back and looked again at the cut line. It wasn't random. It followed a straight angle across my ridge, stopping just short of the HOA's sightline. Not a single branch touched their side. Every cut served one direction. I felt my jaw tighten. The air went quiet except for that one chainsaw still whining behind me. I told her this was private property. She didn't argue. She just handed me a folded paper. Thick. Official looking. It already had my name printed on it. That was the first thing that hit me. They knew exactly whose land this was. I unfolded it. Landscape correction assessment. My name at the top. A number at the bottom that didn't make sense. She said the trees were obstructing premium lake views for the community. Said this was a necessary adjustment. Her tone didn't change once. Like she expected me to accept it. The crew shut off the saw behind me. Silence dropped heavy. I could hear the lake now. Water hitting the shore. Open. Clear. Visible from where her people stood. That's when I noticed something else. The remaining trees weren't random. They formed a narrow gap. A perfect window straight toward the water. It looked intentional. Too intentional. I turned back to her and asked to approve the easement. She didn't answer that directly. Just said everything was filed properly. Then she told the crew to keep moving. Just like that. Like I wasn't even there. I looked down at the paper again. The wording felt off. Not wrong exactly. Just incomplete. Like something important had been left out on purpose. I folded it slowly, eyes still on that perfect gap in the trees. That view wasn't just opened. It was designed. I stayed on that ridge long after the engines shut off, boots sunk in the soft earth where roots used to hold everything together. The air smelled wrong. Too clean. No leaves, no shade, just open light pouring through a gap that had never existed before. I crouched near one of the stumps and ran my hand across the cut. Smooth. Fresh. Professional. This was not some rushed mistake. This was planned down to the inch. I followed the line of cuts again, slower this time, tracing where the trees once stood. My father planted these when I was 10. He spaced them by hand, measuring with an old tape and a piece of chalk. Said the wind came hard off the lake in winter. Said these trees would break it before it hit the house. He never mentioned anything about blocking a view. That part came later. When the subdivision started creeping closer. When people began paying extra for something they did not own. I stood up and looked toward the water again. The lake was wide open now. Clear line of sight from the slope where Meredith stood earlier. Too perfect to be coincidence. I walked the boundary. Markers again. My markers. Steel rods driven 3 feet deep. I knew every one of them. 2 were missing. Not bent. Not loose. Gone. That detail settled in slow. Missing markers meant someone knew exactly where the line was before they moved it. I checked my phone. No emails. No certified letters. No notice filed with the county that I could see. That made it worse. I pulled up the county map app and zoomed in on my parcel. The line still matched what I installed years ago. No update. No easement recorded. At least not publicly. I zoomed out and looked at the neighboring lots. Silver Pines Estate sat just beyond the ridge, a clean row of houses angled toward the lake like seats in a theater. That image stuck with me. Seats. Facing the same direction. Waiting for the same view. I could almost see how they sold it. Premium lakefront sightlines. Unobstructed horizon. It sounded expensive. It also sounded like something you promise before you check who owns the land in front of it. I walked back to the paper Meredith gave me and read it again, slower this time. The language was careful. Too careful. It talked about visual access improvement and community alignment standards, but it never actually cited a recorded easement number. No document reference. Just general wording that sounded official if you did not know what to look for. That was the part that did not sit right. If they had real authority, they would not need vague language. I flipped the page over. Nothing on the back. No signature from the county. Just HOA letterhead and Meredith's name printed at the bottom. Not signed. Printed. I looked back at the ridge one more time. The cut line stopped exactly where the slope dipped toward a higher rise just beyond my property. That rise mattered. I could feel it before I fully thought it through. Elevation changes always mattered. I walked up toward that higher point, counting steps out of habit. 50 yards. Maybe a little more. From there, the lake disappeared again behind the remaining tree line and terrain. The view only existed from a narrow angle. A very specific angle. I turned back toward the stumps and the gap they carved. This was not about clearing trees. This was about controlling where people could see from. And that meant someone had already mapped this out before a single branch hit the ground. I pulled out my keys, thinking about the old barn where my grandfather kept every survey and deed he ever signed. He used to say the land never lies. Only people do. I had not opened that box in years. But something told me the answer was already in there, waiting for me to find it. I pushed the barn door open with my shoulder and felt that dry, dusty air hit my face like it had been waiting for me. The place had not changed in years. Same wooden beams. Same metal shelves. Same old lockbox sitting on the far table where my grandfather left it the last time he walked out. I crossed the floor slow, boots echoing against the concrete, every step louder than it should have been. Something about that ridge followed me in here. I could still see that perfect gap in the trees. Too clean. Too exact. I flipped open the lockbox and dust lifted into the light like smoke. Inside were folders stacked by decade, tied with fading twine. My grandfather labeled everything by hand. Year. Parcel. Notes. No shortcuts. I pulled the 1974 folder first. That was the year he surveyed the ridge after buying the upper acreage. The paper felt thin but solid. Ink still sharp. Lines drawn with a steady hand. I spread it across the table and leaned in. The ridge line ran exactly where I remembered. But there was something else marked along the slope. A narrow band. Not labeled as a path. Not labeled as access. Just a shaded strip with small notes written in the margin. I leaned closer and read it twice. Windbreak preservation. Do not clear. That was not just a suggestion. That was recorded intent. I flipped to the deed copy behind it. Legal language. Tight. Specific. The kind that only matters when someone tries to ignore it. The ridge was not just mine. It was protected as a natural barrier tied to soil stability and water runoff. That explained the tree spacing. That explained everything my father said without explaining it fully. I pulled another file. This one newer. Late 90s. That was when the first development proposal came in near the lake. I remembered the arguments back then. People wanted access. They wanted sight lines. They wanted to turn quiet land into something marketable. I scanned the document. There it was. Visual access request denied due to existing conservation barrier. Denied. Not modified. Not negotiated. Denied. My fingers tightened on the page. That meant something had changed since then. Or someone was pretending it had. I reached for the county addendum records in the next folder. If an easement existed, it had to be recorded somewhere. It had to leave a trail. That is how this works. Always has. I flipped through page after page. Survey updates. Tax adjustments. Boundary confirmations. Nothing about a view corridor. Nothing about shared visual access. The silence in that barn got heavier with every page I turned. I stopped and looked back at the 1974 map again. That shaded strip along the ridge suddenly felt different. Not just protection. Control. Whoever owned that elevation controlled what could be seen beyond it. That was not accidental. My grandfather knew exactly what he was doing when he bought that upper line. He did not block the view. He controlled it. I leaned back and let that settle in. Meredith did not just cut trees. She carved a window through something that was never meant to be opened. And if she thought that window belonged to her community, then she was betting on something I had not seen yet. I closed the folder slowly and reached for the most recent county filings. Because if she was that confident, she had to be hiding it somewhere deeper. I drove into the county records office just after noon, the sun sitting high and harsh over the parking lot, heat rising off the asphalt in slow waves. The building looked the same as it always had. Brick. Quiet. Almost empty this time of day. Inside, the air felt cooler, but not by much. Paper and dust hung in the background like a permanent smell. I signed in, nodded to the clerk, and walked straight to the public records terminal. No conversation. No small talk. My name was already on that paper Meredith handed me. That meant this was not a guess. This was prepared. I pulled up my parcel. First. Same boundaries. Same legal description. No recent changes. No filed easement. Nothing that gave anyone the right to step on that ridge, let alone cut through it. I scrolled slower this time, checking every entry line by line. Still nothing. That should have been the end of it. But it was not. Because Meredith did not act like someone guessing. She acted like someone who thought she already won. I switched to the neighboring development records. Silver Pines Estates. The full subdivision file loaded in sections. Plat maps. Amendments. Lot splits. I opened the original plat first. Clean layout. Houses angled toward the lake exactly like I remembered. That theater image came back again. Rows. Facing forward. expecting something. I zoomed into the edge where their lots met my ridge. There it was. A thin line labeled Future View Alignment. Not an easement. Not a right. Just a note. A placeholder. Something they intended, not something they owned. That detail stuck with me. I opened the next amendment. Then the next. Changes to drainage. Changes to road access. Nothing about view rights being granted. But one document stood out. It was filed 3 years after the original plat. A supplemental disclosure. Buried deep in the stack. I opened it and leaned closer. The language was careful again. Too careful. Developer acknowledges visual dependency on adjacent ridge line not owned within subdivision boundary. Dependency. That word mattered. It meant their entire marketing angle relied on land they did not control. I felt a slow pressure build behind my eyes. That explained the confidence. Not because they had the right. Because they needed it. I checked the signature line. Signed by the original developer. Not Meredith. Not the current HOA. That meant this information existed before she ever took that position. And if she had access to these records, then she knew exactly what she was doing. I leaned back in the chair and looked at the screen again. The words did not change. They just sat there. Quiet. Waiting. No easement granted. No legal access. Just dependency. I thought about that gap in the trees again. That perfect angle. That narrow window. They were not just opening a view. They were trying to lock it in. Create something that looked permanent before anyone questioned it. I scrolled further down and found another entry tied to recent HOA filings. Maintenance notices. Landscaping adjustments. Internal approvals. All stamped by the HOA board. None of them referenced county authorization. That was the line they crossed. Quietly. Intentionally. I printed the documents I needed and held them in my hand for a moment. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Not because of what it said. Because of what it confirmed. Meredith was not fixing a problem. She was building leverage. I walked out of the office without saying a word, the sunlight hitting harder this time as I stepped back into the heat. The ridge came back into my mind immediately. That line of cuts. That perfect view. That missing piece. And suddenly, I realized something I had missed before. I did not drive straight home. I pulled over halfway up the ridge road and just sat there with the engine idling, papers spread across the passenger seat like pieces of something that finally started to fit. The heat pressed against the windshield. No wind. No sound except the ticking engine cooling down. I read that word again in my head. Dependency. Not ownership. Not access. Dependency. That meant everything Silver Pines sold was built on something they never controlled. And that meant the view they just carved open was never guaranteed. I stepped out of the truck and walked up the gravel shoulder, boots crunching slow. From that angle, I could see the ridge the way they saw it. Clean line. Open gap. Lake shining through like it belonged there. But the rest of the ridge still stood behind it. Higher. Slightly offset. That part mattered more than I realized before. I walked further up, measuring the slope with my steps, counting distance without thinking. 40 yards. Maybe 50. Enough elevation change to break a sightline completely if something stood there. I stopped and turned back toward the subdivision. From this exact point, the lake disappeared again behind the remaining trees and the natural rise of the land. The view they created only worked from one narrow window. One angle. One height. That was the trick. They did not open the view. They exposed a weakness. I stood there a moment longer, letting that settle in. My grandfather did not just protect this ridge. He designed it. The windbreak note. The spacing. The elevation line. All of it worked together. Not just to block wind. To control what passed through that space. Air. Water. And apparently sight. I looked down at the papers again, then back toward the gap they cut. Meredith was not guessing. She knew exactly where to cut to get that window. Which meant she had access to more than just HOA paperwork. She had to have seen something like what I was holding now. Or someone told her where to look. That thought stayed with me longer than I liked. I walked back to the truck and leaned against the door, eyes still locked on that ridge. If they were depending on that view to hold property value, then losing it would not just be an inconvenience. It would be leverage. Real leverage. But this was not about revenge. Not yet. This was about control. Legal control. Everything had to be clean. Documented. Filed. Because if I moved wrong, they would bury me in paperwork before I ever touched that ridge again. I folded the documents carefully and set them back on the seat. My hands were steady now. That surprised me. This morning felt different. Raw. Unclear. Now it felt sharp. Defined. Like a line had been drawn whether I wanted it or not. I started the truck and headed back down toward the ranch. As I passed the cut line again, something else caught my eye. Stakes. New ones. Taller. Placed along the edge of the gap they created. Not boundary markers. Something else. I slowed down and rolled the window down. Each stake had a small flag tied to it. Bright. Clean. Measured at equal intervals. I knew that spacing. It was not random. It was survey spacing. But I had not hired a surveyor. I stepped out again and walked closer, counting the distance between each flag. 10 feet. Exactly 10 feet apart. That was not for marking trees. That was for planning placement. I followed the line of flags toward the center of the gap, then stopped when I saw what they were aligned to. Not the lake. Not the houses. Something higher up the ridge. Something they had not touched yet. That was when it clicked. They were not finished. I stood there staring at those flags until the pattern stopped feeling like coincidence. 10 feet apart. Straight line. Perfect alignment toward the upper ridge. Not the lake. Not the houses. Something beyond the gap they already cut. I crouched down and pressed my fingers into the dirt beside one of the stakes. Fresh. Not more than a few hours old. That meant they came back after I left this morning. Quietly. No notice. No crew noise this time. Just placement. Planning. That told me everything. The cutting was phase 1. This was something else. I followed the line uphill, boots sliding slightly on the loose soil where roots used to hold it firm. The air felt different here. Thinner. Exposed. Without the trees, the ridge did not just look wrong. It felt unstable. I stopped halfway up and turned back again, forcing myself to see it from their side. The gap they opened framed the lake perfectly. But these new flags shifted that frame upward. Higher angle. Wider field. That was not just a view. That was expansion. I kept walking until I reached the last marker. It sat just below the crest line where my land rose above everything else. From here, if something tall stood in that exact position, it would dominate the entire sightline. Not block it completely. Control it. That word came back again. Control. I stood still for a second longer, letting the idea form fully this time. They were not done cutting. They were preparing to install something. Something fixed. Something permanent enough to lock that view in place so nobody could challenge it later. Because once it existed long enough, people would assume it had always been there. That was how these things worked. You create the illusion first. Then you defend it as if it is law. I stepped back and scanned the ridge more carefully. There were no permit tags. No county markers. No utility flags. Nothing that said this had been approved through any official channel. Just those clean, evenly spaced stakes marching up my land like someone already believed they had the right. That confidence bothered me more than anything else. I pulled my phone out and started recording, walking the entire line from bottom to top, capturing each flag, each distance, each angle. Documentation first. Always. The wind picked up slightly as I reached the crest, moving through the remaining trees with a dry, hollow sound. Without the full windbreak, it carried differently. Sharper. Faster. I looked down toward the houses again. From this height, the entire subdivision sat exposed, every roof angled toward that gap like it was a stage. And right in the center of that stage, those flags pointed to one exact spot. I narrowed my eyes and followed the alignment again, this time past the ridge, past the trees, past the lake. It lined up with something else. Something I had not noticed before because it sat just out of view from the lower slope. A small clearing further down, near the shared boundary where the old access trail used to run before it was closed off years ago. That trail mattered. It was the only place where a structure could be brought in without crossing deep into protected ground. I felt my pulse slow down as the pieces locked together. They were not just opening a view. They were preparing to anchor it. And if they placed something there, something visible, something tall enough, they could claim it as part of their community improvement and fight to keep it later. I lowered my phone and looked back at the ridge one more time. The cut line. The flags. The alignment. None of it was random. It was staged. Carefully. Quietly. And whatever they planned next, it was already in motion. I did not wait for morning this time. I drove straight to the survey office before they even flipped the open sign, parked crooked, and sat there with my engine running until someone unlocked the door. The same guy who handled my boundary markers years ago looked up when I walked in. He did not smile. He just nodded like he already knew something was off. I laid the photos on the counter one by one. The cut line. The missing markers. The flags spaced 10 feet apart. He leaned over them without saying a word, then pulled out a ruler from his desk and measured the spacing off the image like he did not trust his eyes. "That is layout work," he said finally. "Not guessing. Not trimming. Layout." That word settled heavier than anything I had heard all day. I asked him what kind of structure uses 10-foot intervals on a slope like that. He did not answer right away. He just walked to the back, grabbed a binder, and flipped it open to a page filled with diagrams. Retaining systems. Windbreak structures. Observation decks. He tapped one diagram and slid it toward me. Vertical posts. Anchored in a straight line. Height variable. Positioned along elevation to control sight lines. I stared at it longer than I needed to. It matched too clean. Too exact. He asked if I had approved any permits. I shook my head. He looked back at the photos and exhaled slow. "Then they are building something they cannot legally defend," he said. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just matter of fact. That was the first time all day someone said it out loud. I asked him what happens if they finish it. He did not hesitate. "If it stands long enough, they will argue it belongs there." That sentence sat between us for a second. Because that was the real game. Not just building it. Letting it exist long enough to make it harder to remove. I gathered the photos back up and thanked him, but I was already moving in my head. Timing. Sequence. What comes first? What stops it clean without stepping outside the line? I drove back toward the ranch with the windows down, letting the air cut through the heat inside the truck. The ridge came into view again as I turned onto the gravel road. From a distance, it looked calm. Quiet. Like nothing had changed. But I knew better now. I slowed as I approached the cut line and saw something new. Equipment. Not heavy machinery. Smaller. Precise. Post drivers stacked neatly near the base of the slope. Bundled lumber off to the side. No workers. No noise. Just materials waiting. That meant they were coming back. Soon. Maybe tonight. Maybe at first light. I stepped out and walked toward the stacks, careful not to cross into where they had placed those flags. Everything was positioned just outside the obvious line. Close enough to move. Fast when they started. Far enough to claim they had not begun yet. That kind of detail told me whoever planned this understood timing. Understood how to stay just inside the gray zone. I turned and looked up the ridge again, following the line of flags to the crest where everything would come together. The wind moved through the remaining trees, sharper now, less filtered. It carried a dry sound across the slope, like something unfinished. I could already see it in my head. Posts rising along that line. A frame cutting across the skyline. Permanent. Visible from every house below. Something they could point to and say, it is already there. I stood there a moment longer, letting that image settle in. Because once it stood, everything changed. I pulled my phone out again and checked the time, then looked back at the ridge. If they were planning to move this fast, then I had less time than I thought. And whatever I did next had to happen before the first post touched that ground. I did not go back inside the house. I stayed in the truck, engine off this time, watching the ridge as the lights started to drop. The air cooled fast once the sun dipped behind the trees, and the slope turned into a long shadow that stretched straight towards silver pines. That shadow mattered. It hid movement. It hid timing. I checked the clock again. Late afternoon. Too early for them to start. Too late for them to wait long. People like Meredith did not leave materials sitting overnight unless everything else was already lined up. That meant permits or something that looked close enough to one. I pulled out my phone and called the county planning office. No answer at first. Then a voicemail. I left my name, my parcel number, and one simple question. Any approved structure on my ridge? No explanation. No detail. I hung up and stared back at those stacks of lumber. Clean cuts. Pre-measured lengths. This was not a guess. Someone ordered exactly what they needed. I stepped out and walked the perimeter again, slower this time, looking for anything I missed. At the edge of the material pile, half covered under a tarp, I saw a flat metal box. I pulled the tarp back just enough to see the label. Contractor supply. Not local. That stood out. Most crews around here sourced from the same 2 yards. This came from out of county. That meant planning ahead. Ordering before today. I let the tarp fall back into place and stepped away. My phone buzzed in my hand. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. It was the planning office. The voice on the line sounded tired, like they had already checked something twice before calling me back. No permits filed for your parcel, she said. None pending. None approved. I asked about any filings tied to the subdivision next door. She paused. Papers shuffled on her end. Then she said there was a general improvement request submitted by the HOA last week. Landscaping enhancement. No structural approval attached. That was the gap they were using. Landscaping. That word could stretch just far enough to start something before anyone stopped them. I thanked her and hung up, the answer settling in clear and sharp. They were about to build something they could not legally finish, hoping it would stand long enough to make it difficult to remove. I looked back up the ridge and felt the wind shift again, moving faster through the open gap. Without the trees, the sound carried straight across the slope, low and steady. It sounded like pressure building. I walked to the base of the first flag and stood there, measuring the distance with my eyes one more time. 10 feet. Every line leading to that same point near the crest. I knew what they were aiming for now. Not just height. Position. If they set even the first few posts, they could claim ongoing work. Claim progress. That was enough to drag it out. I pulled my phone back out and opened the photos I took earlier, scrolling through each angle, each measurement, each detail. Everything lined up too perfectly to ignore. I zoomed in on the ridge crest and held the screen up against the real view in front of me. Same angle. Same line. Same end point. That was when something else clicked. The spot they chose was not just high. It sat just inside a narrow section of my parcel where the terrain dipped before rising again. If they placed posts there, it would not just frame the lake. It would anchor their entire argument to a point that looked like natural ground. Harder to challenge. Harder to remove. I lowered the phone slowly and looked back at the material stack, then up the ridge again. Everything they needed was already here. Everything except time. I checked the horizon once more as the last light slipped off the top of the trees. If they were coming tonight, I would hear them before I saw them. I did not sleep that night. I stayed in the truck with the windows cracked, the ridge barely visible under a thin wash of moonlight, every sound carrying farther now that the trees were gone. Around midnight, I heard it. Not loud. Not heavy. Just the low hum of an engine idling somewhere beyond the slope. Then another. Headlights stayed off at first. That told me everything. They were trying to move quiet. I stepped out slowly, boots pressing into the cold dirt, and listened again. Metal shifted. A dull clink. Someone unloading tools without wanting to be heard. I moved closer but stopped short of the flags. No reason to give them anything they could twist later. From where I stood, I could see silhouettes now. 3, maybe 4 people. Working fast. Focused. One of them set something upright near the first flag. A post. Tall enough to break the line of the ridge even in low light. They were not testing. They were committing. I pulled my phone out and started recording again, steady this time, every movement, every placement. No voices carried over the wind. Just the rhythm of work. Measured. Practiced. Like they had done this before somewhere else. That thought stayed with me. Meredith did not just come up with this. She learned it. Or hired someone who had. The first post went in clean. No hesitation. They checked alignment with a laser level. That caught my eye. Red line cutting through the dark, marking a path straight across the ridge. That was their spine. Everything would build off that. If that line stayed, the rest would follow. I lowered the phone for a second and looked up toward the crest where the land dipped just enough to hide the base of the post from below. From the houses, it would look like it belonged there. Natural. Fixed. That was the whole trick. I felt the wind pick up again, stronger now, cutting through the open gap and pushing against that first post. It held. Barely moved. That told me it was anchored deeper than it looked. They knew the soil. They knew the ridge. Or they had been told. I stepped back, keeping my distance, letting the camera run. Evidence first. Always. Because once that second post went in, this would not be a question anymore. It would be a problem. A bigger one. I watched as they moved down the line, marking the next point, checking spacing again. 10 feet. Exact. No mistakes. No hesitation. That level of precision does not come from guesswork. It comes from a plan already signed off somewhere, even if it was not legal. I looked down at the papers sitting on the passenger seat of my truck, edges catching the faint light. Dependency. No easement. No approval. Everything they were doing right now depended on one thing. Time. If they got enough of this structure in place, they would argue it stayed. If they finished it, they would fight to keep it. I turned back to the ridge and watched the second post rise into place, the red laser line cutting straight through both of them now, forming the start of something that would not be easy to remove. The wind hit again, stronger this time, pushing through the gap and across the slope, carrying the sound of water from the lake up to where I stood. Clear. Open. Exactly what they wanted everyone to see. I steadied the phone and zoomed in on the alignment, on the base, on the flags that led all the way up the ridge like a path they had already claimed. This was not going to stop on its own. And if I waited until morning, it might already be too late.